Babylon 5 is a TV series that's centered around a space station located in neutral territory where different governments go to try to work out their differences. So it's kind of a UN in space. As the series progresses, the storytelling takes on a more galactic setting where we start visiting different homeworlds. I think it could be seen to start out with as just kind of a central space station that lots of commerce and negotiations happen at. It reminds me a bit of like older movies like Casablanca back in the day. It's kind of this hub where there's commerce and trade and all sorts of other stuff going on. That's essentially what Babylon 5 is. It is called Babylon 5. Stations 1 through 3 were destroyed / sabotaged, and Station 4 disappeared without a trace 24 hours after it was operational. And the series does cover that, and so this is the 5th of the Babylon stations. The story centers around the different ambassadors for the different races that are visiting and sponsoring the station. There are lots of different races that you meet, and you get to really flesh out a lot of cultures here. Another concept that you find out at the beginning, and they start to really flesh that out a bit more too, is the Earth Alliance. They have a group of telepaths that sprung up. They have a regulatory agency that keeps individuals with telepathic powers in check called Psycor. And they develop what that sort of institution, the implications of having something like that and oppressing a certain group of people as the series goes on. All the other races have telepaths of some sort, well, save one, but they used to have them, and they cover that later in the series.
Babylon 5: The Gathering. We watched both the original pilot that aired in 1993 and the TNT The Gathering version that originally aired in 1998. Given that the pilot was made before the rest of the series, there are a few character differences, which we will get into after the recap. The story begins with Londo giving a voiceover with background information about the Babylon stations and how they were built to bring different species together in peaceful coexistence, giving them a place to work out their differences, etc. The core group of ambassadors are Delenn from Minbar, Londo of the Centauri, G'Kar of the Narn, and Kosh from the Vorlon. Everyone is pretty excited because they've never actually seen a Vorlon before, and Ambassador Kosh's arrival is a big deal. It's an even bigger deal when Kosh collapses just after he's arrived. Dr. Kyle is unable to treat Kosh without removing his encounter suit, but the Vorlon have forbidden removing the suit. Sinclair decides to go ahead and open the suit and have the doctor try to save Kosh. Dr. Kyle believes Kosh has been poisoned, but he's unable to determine how or which poison was used. In order to save Ambassador Kosh, this information is crucial. So telepath Lita Alexander is brought in to scan the ambassador to find out what happened to him. The scan is successful. They determine how Kosh was poisoned, which allows Dr. Kyle to get a sample of the poison, and the effort to save Kosh becomes a race against time to develop and administer the antidote. While scanning Kosh, Lita saw the attacker, and it appears that it was Commander Sinclair. An investigation gets underway. Ambassador G'Kar engages in some blackmail to get Londo to go along with G'Kar's proposal that Commander Sinclair's trial be moved to the Vorlon homeworld. G'Kar's motion is successful, and the Vorlon are on their way to Babylon 5. Meanwhile, Mr. Garibaldi continues to investigate and exposes a plot perpetrated by a member of the Minbari warrior caste, just in time to stop the Vorlon from firing on the station. Kosh recovers. Delenn apologizes to Commander Sinclair and provides him with a record of the Minbari warrior's travels before he arrived on Babylon 5. Sinclair discovers that G'Kar was in on the plot. G'Kar points out that with the other plotters dead, Sinclair has no proof. So Sinclair tells G'Kar that G'Kar has just drunk a tracker that has attached itself to G'Kar's intestines, and G'Kar storms out of the room. Sinclair confesses to Garibaldi that he really hadn't dosed G'Kar with a transmitter, and Garibaldi asks Sinclair if he has any idea about the tests they'll put G'Kar through, looking for the transmitter that's not there. Sinclair simply replies, yes. Kosh is introduced at a reception, during which Sinclair and Delenn talk in the Arboretum, and Sinclair asks Delenn if she's holding out on him about the 24-hour gap in his memory from the Earth-Minbari War. She tells him she'd never tell him anything that was not in his best interest. In the gathering, we have Lieutenant Commander Laurel Takashima, who is replaced in the series by Lieutenant Commander Susan Ivanova. Dr. Ben Kyle gets replaced by Dr. Stephen Franklin. Lita Alexander is replaced by Talia Winters, but then replaces her later in the series. There were minimal differences between the original pilot and the remastered The Gathering. The remastered version minimalized the aliens, especially the more puppety-looking aliens, and those that Lita and Commander Sinclair walked by that looked like they were on display in a zoo. The remastered version also upped the drama with more crime, action, and even sexual references. For me, the biggest differences were the change in the responsibility of the plot from the Narn government to G'Kar specifically. This made more sense to me in justifying Sinclair's actions in leading G'Kar to believe that he had been tagged with a nano-tracker. The other big difference was when Kosh was poisoned. In the remastered version, he addresses who he believes to be Sinclair as future Valen, and this dialogue was not included in the original pilot. There were some holes in the plot, but I found one to be the most egregious. It has to do with how the poison was administered to Kosh. It doesn't make any sense that phony Sinclair could apply the poison patch while shaking Kosh's hand through the encounter suit. Why would Kosh's hand be outside the encounter suit, and does Kosh really have a hand like that to administer poison to at all? It was just a very strange plot hole to have in this story. But that is my take on The Gathering for Babylon 5.
That plot hole you mentioned about Kosh and the hand and the poison administer point, I agree with you. In narrative, they tried to explain it that because Lita was using her telepathic powers to see what happened going through Kosh's mind, that she would see things from her perspective, which is how they tried to explain this. But even if we assume that from her perspective, an arm was reached out to shake Sinclair's hand, or like you put, fake Sinclair's hand, how? After the poison was administered, Kosh was rendered unconscious. Sinclair mentioned to Garibaldi that you can't take him out of that encounter suit because he can't take our atmosphere. So how could a hand have gotten out there? Mostly trying to avoid spoilers for the series here, but later we find out in the series what the Vorlons actually are. And to put it nicely, something that's barely corporeal, how is that even a thing? How is that poison even a thing? That didn't make a lot of sense to me, but this was a pilot. And I guess what we need to remember, because now I'm not sure they do, if they do pilots, I don't know if they air them. Pilots used to be when a person or group of people would scrape together enough money to create kind of a proof of concept that they would film, and then they would get a meeting with a big network, and then they would send that pilot to them and then have a meeting to try to say, hey, I'd like to go from pilot to turning this into a series. So that's what this was. And I can forgive some of the stuff that came later. Like, to me, one of the scenes that I didn't like in the pilot at all was when Delenn and G'Kar were talking, and then Delenn opened up this cabinet or whatever, and she had like these collection of rings, like Lord of the Rings rings, and she put one on and was like using it to like gravity crush G'Kar. From my point of view, that seems silly. Even now, that seems silly. And Mollie and I were talking, we were watching this, and it's like, you know, other than talking about G'Kar knew about the Grey Council, there really wasn't a lot of usefulness in that scene. So you could even live with cutting that out, even the Grey Council stuff. And I think the pilot would work much better not having that ring scene, because you never see those rings again. They clearly figured out this was a bad idea, and they didn't bother to revisit it again. The difference between the two versions, I know Mollie and I had quite the debate because we watched both of them. Babylon 5 first came out, I remember the original pilot, and then you couldn't find that again. But I remember I had a friend that knew somebody in Japan, and I guess it was released on VHS, and so he was able to get a copy of that, and somehow he was able to get it so it worked in the VCRs here. I mean, maybe they always work here. I don't know enough about whether Japanese VCRs work here, but I remember going over to his apartment at the time and watching that. And I'm like, man, I haven't watched that. It was a couple of years since I've watched that. So that was pretty cool. The big difference when you watch this to know which version am I watching, it's pretty easy to determine. One is the composer of the original pilot is different than the composer that not only did the other pilot, the remastered pilot, but the remastered pilot was done by the same person who did the series as far as the music. So Christopher Frank is the composer that did the Babylon 5 series, and he also did the composition for the 1998 remaster. But in 1993, the original pilot, it was Stuart Copeland that was the original composer. And although his music had that electronica sound to it, it was very different than Christopher Frank. Personally, for that pilot, I enjoyed the Stuart Copeland soundtrack better. I thought it added a edge to Babylon 5 because Stuart Copeland, he did lots of smaller things, but I think most people would know him from, if you go back and watch the original 1980s Equalizer TV series, he did the music for that. So if you know what the music was in that series, you know the type of music he did. I just felt it kind of had the Babylon 5 pilot with the original music had kind of like a cyberpunky feel to it based on that music. Now, I think Mollie's reply when she and I were talking about this is I think she admitted that. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but you also said, but if somebody's going to watch the pilot to get into the series, you probably would recommend going with the TNT remaster because that music is going to be so different than what they get for the rest of the series that it might be very jarring.
Yeah, because that TNT cut of the pilot was clearly made after several seasons of the show had already aired. So at that point, well, they knew exactly what went on in the series. So it would make sense that they would, if you're going to recut it, that you would recut it in a way that would match the series better than the original pilot wound up matching it. So that's why I would go with the TNT version of The Gathering instead of the original Babylon 5 pilot if it was being shown to a newbie who was trying to get into the Babylon 5 series for the very first time without having seen any of it first. Definitely I would go with the TNT version.
I think I would make sure that if somebody does watch Babylon 5, that they seek out the original pilot. Because I do think there's a data point in history to get out of this by watching the original pilot. Because of the music, and by the way, the font for the credits and stuff, Babylon 5, the proper series, has like this blue font and it has a certain look to it that is consistent with the TNT remaster. But on the original pilot, the lettering was like, I guess to be kind of crude here, it was very amateur looking. It almost looked like a typewriter font. It looked very low budget. And for me, I like that kind of stuff. I mean, I think I've mentioned before on this channel, like I watch fan films and I don't like it so low that it's unwatchable, but I also like watching low budget stuff. Just there's something about low budget stuff. Both Mollie and I have talked about we like asylum films. There's just something about that. So that kind of low budgety feel worked for me in the original pilot. And the music worked for me in the original pilot. But that's just my preference. There were some extra scenes. Well, actually in both. The TNT remaster, they added some scenes that wasn't in the original. And the original had a bunch of scenes that the TNT remaster cut out. One of which was when Lita and Jakar were negotiating Lita's DNA, I guess we'll say. And there was this concept that they called privacy or silence. I think it was privacy. And they had this kind of cheesy effect where the lights, you were looking from above, looking down at them at a table, and these lights kind of spun around the on the floor, there was like a light shining down there, and they kind of formed little segments of things, and they kind of spun around and joined together to show like a circling of the table. And then it was supposed to be a place where you could talk and not be listened to. And the effect itself was cheesy, but I liked the concept. In the original, you saw that being used, but in the remaster, they just kind of cut the whole piece of dialogue out where one of them asked, hey, can I invoke silence so we can talk privately? It's a minor thing, but honestly, I thought it added a little to that environment they were setting up. And then when Sinclair was walking with Lita through the alien sector, and I can appreciate having those rooms with the glass walls, it did make the aliens look like they were in a zoo, which probably was not representative of what they were trying to convey with that. But at the same time, it did set a feeling for the station, and there was a certain alien feeling to what they were doing, even if they were puppets in some cases. I was thinking about this as far as how I would recommend somebody starting Babylon 5. I think if somebody has to watch a first episode, then I think I agree with Mollie that the TNT remastered version makes the most sense. But after thinking about it for a while, they flesh out everything you need to know in the series. And honestly, even in the remastered pilot, they do their best to line it up, but some stuff just doesn't line up. I might recommend that you don't watch the original pilot or the remastered pilot first, that you jump right into the first episode of the series.
Oh, I can get behind that. I can definitely agree with that. I'll also say that if you're interested in seeing what I think the initial intention was, the original idea of what Babylon 5 was supposed to be or what they wanted it to be, watch the original pilot, because that's the first attempt at getting something made for television. That's, I think, what they originally wanted to do. And then what you actually get in a series, it's what's been tweaked after Suits have given feedback. So I say definitely you should go back and watch the original pilot at some point so that you get an idea of what they intended to do, what they really wanted.
The original pilot I kind of look at like, you know how the cage is to the original series of Star Trek, where, yeah, you can watch it and it kind of lines up, but Spock having those emotions and number one just kind of disappears and the same actress becomes Nurse Chapel. That's the type of thing that's going on here. Mm-hmm. So it's good to watch, but I'm not sure it's a good point to start watching any more than I think watching The Cage is a good place to start watching the original series of Star Trek.
Yeah. And it was also fun because the guy who goes on to play Mr. Morden in the series, he was one of the bridge crew in the pilot.
Yep.
And obviously The Gathering. So that's just a fun little Easter egg to see that actor in a different role.
Yeah, it's not oh, look, he was back then, he was still... You're not supposed to associate that with the original Morden character. It's an Easter egg. It's a completely different character.
Yeah.
I guess what I want to say here also is for people who haven't watched Babylon 5 or who have tried to watch it and said, well, this is the argument I keep hearing, and I push back a little bit because the argument I hear is, man, that first season, that was really rough, the production standards and so forth. And I would fire back, well, were you able to get through the first season of The Next Generation? Because I would argue the production standards of that first season of TNG was pretty bad. Now, I enjoyed a lot of that first season because even in the first season of TNG, they had different music in the background as well, more electronic-y than what they eventually turned it into. But those who say, oh my gosh, the production standards are just so bad on the first season of Babylon 5, it's like, really? I mean, I'm not trying to argue that you're wrong. I'm just saying, from my opinion, I don't think they're any worse than the first season of TNG. So if you can watch season 1 of TNG, you should be able to watch Babylon 5, because by the time you get to the end of season 2 and into season 3, the production standards of Babylon 5 are on par with Deep Space Nine or Voyager or later TNG. So it does get to a point where it's at least on par with those other shows. But self-admitting that first season, the production standards are iffy. But I would argue there's some good stories in season 1 that set up a lot of what happens later. Just kind of suck it up and get through season 1. I've heard some people say, well, you can just kind of skip over season... No, you can't. You can't skip over season 1. We recommended skipping the pilot because they flesh out enough in season 1 where you figure out what you missed in the pilot, but you cannot skip season 1. Another thing about Babylon 5, if you haven't watched it before, people who claim this is a filler episode. Yes, Babylon 5 had some story ideas that didn't add to the arc. But in every single episode, there's always some part of the story that adds to a character development or adds to the universe building. Because usually Babylon 5 has an A and a B story in an episode. If you don't like the A story, there's usually a B story that's interesting. Because like one of my least favorite episodes of season 1 is TKO, and that has to do with Walker Smith, that martial arts fighter who tries to join this alien fight club or whatever you want to call that. That story I don't care about at all. But the B story where Ivanova was dealing with her father's death and her rabbi came to visit her, I thought that was really well done. Yeah, the boxing part, the fighting part, didn't care for, but the Ivanova stuff I did care for. And I would argue every single episode has that, and I don't think I would call that filler because it's developing the character. Is it adding to a modern arc like we have today? No, but we also have longer than 10 episode season. Babylon 5 has 22 episode seasons. Yes, if you want to call it filler, it depends on how you define filler. I call it fleshing out the universe. And by the time you get to the mid-season 2, you're mostly dealing with arc pushing forward stuff. And by the time you get the mid-season 3 and 4, like every episode's pushing the arc forward. And this was groundbreaking back in the time for American television for them to do this, US-based television. So that's the biggest complaint I've heard from people who are like, well, I want to watch Babylon 5, but that season 1, I tried an episode or two, and the production standards, it's like, yeah, come on. I mean, look at it from a TNG season 1. Now, if you're going to say, well, I can't watch TNG season 1 either, fair enough. But I also think you're missing some good stuff in season 1 of TNG as well. But that's just me. The recommendation, I think, from me is we talked about the pilot here just to get people started with the Babylon 5 series. I don't know how many people, I know our channel is heavily Star Trek based, but if you haven't watched Babylon 5, you might want to give it a try. I mean, they just had a new animation come out a couple of months ago. So this might be a good time to start at the beginning and work your way through. And there's some excellent characters in this series, some great storylines. They cover all sorts of things like growing fascism and dealing with civil war, not just civil wars, but then the reconstruction if you get through a civil war and what has to be built afterwards. This show is really meant for adults to watch science fiction. Babylon 5 was like the Expanse of the 1990s. And I mean that in a significant way because it was that big of a deal back in the day, at least I thought it was. And I think if you haven't watched Babylon 5, I think you're doing a disservice if you're trying to round your education of science fiction shows.
Yeah, and given how little new stuff there is to watch these days, yeah, if you haven't seen it, then you're in luck because here's a new show that has a proper length season to it with 22 episodes, unlike the 10 to 13 we get these days. And if it's brand new for you, boy, are you in for a treat because it does the traditional A story, B story storytelling that a lot of us grew up watching. And you're not going to get a lot of the political infusions of today that will cloud the stories. So it's actually a real relief to watch a show like that that's really out of time as far as being able to escape 2023. So I would highly recommend giving it a try if you haven't watched it already.
Now the problem is it used to be on what used to be called HBO Max. Now it's just Max. But I don't believe it's on there anymore. Mollie and I have the box set. But if I'm remembering correctly, I believe there's going to be a new release of media coming out this January. And somehow I've heard that it might be like a remastered HD type version. Because I was always told that Babylon 5 could never get an HD remaster because the amount of compositing that was done in the series and a lot of the original footage that you would need for the compositing is gone. that I didn't think it was possible. I don't know if this is an AI upres of the thing coming up here, but that's just the rumor anyway. I mean, if anybody knows any more than that, feel free to leave some information in the comments below. That's the downside, is right now I don't know where you can watch it because I don't think it's on any streaming service. It might be on the Roku channel, maybe, but I'm not 100% sure about that.
Yeah, so if anybody knows, drop that in the comments below as well. Where can people go to watch the series right now? How many of you out there are Babylon 5 fans, and how many of you haven't seen this already? Let us know in the comments below. We always enjoy reading these comments, and we love getting new thoughts on things. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Take care.